Good afternoon, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to the New York City Alliance webinar on healthy masculinity as it relates to sexual violence prevention. This program is a follow-up to the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assaults Engaging Men webinar, which is available on their website. We will begin shortly. Please make sure your computer is compatible and remember to dial in for audio and sign into ReadyTalk. The information you need is on the screen and tells you how to access the webinar recordings. For the text chat, you can type in the box to your left and only the presenters will see the questions or the comments that you ask. The audio and PowerPoint slides will move automatically throughout the presentation. A recording of this webinar will be available on our website later in the week. If you're having any trouble, please dial the number listed on the screen and we will assist you. The Alliance is proud to be designated by the New York State Department of Health as a Center of Excellence in Primary Prevention. Please visit the Center of Excellence pages at our website where you can access primary prevention resources, articles, our digests, and different announcements. The vision of the Alliance is that we envision a city free from sexual violence, and our mission is to prevent sexual violence and reduce the harm it causes through education, advocacy, and research. After today's webinar, we hope participants will feel more inclined to incorporate elements of healthy masculinity and male engagement into current prevention practices. We also hope participants will acquire a better understanding of healthy masculinity and how it can be used in prevention efforts to mitigate or eliminate harmful social norms at the root of sexual violence. On the flip side, we also want audience members to gain a stronger understanding of the ways in which traditional notions of masculinity undermine health promotion and perpetuate sexual violence. Finally, we want viewers to come away with an increased awareness of existing healthy masculinity and male engagement efforts and the challenges and limitations that are frequently encountered. If we take a look at the guiding documents provided by the New York State Department of Health for rape crisis and sexual violence primary prevention programs, we see a focus on engaging men and boys as well as youth, especially high-risk youth including LGBTQ. The DOH-RFA stresses the need for healthy masculinity programming in sexual violence primary prevention education by encouraging the use of at least one of the following national curricula. You see them listed on the slide, and they include the Council for Boys and Young Men, Men of Strength Clubs, which is a component of Men Can Stop Rape, Expect, Respect, and Mentors in Violence Prevention. We will briefly talk about other curricula and simple activities to engage men and boys in discussion on healthy masculinity. Nation et al.'s 2005 list of 9 principles for effective primary prevention efforts has also been assimilated into New York State prevention work. Listed here are 4 of these concepts that most directly apply to healthy masculinity programs, which should be empirically based, appropriately tailored for the audience, and initiated early enough to have an impact on the development of the problem behavior. In addition to these guidelines, 2 complementary models, the spectrum of prevention and the social ecological model, have been used to create a framework for prevention approaches which must target the underlying conditions and harmful cultural norms at the root of sexual violence by changing attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors within at least 2 of the 4 levels of the social ecological model. Prevention literature suggests that many of these harmful norms, such as objectification of women, violence tolerance, oppression, and traditional constructs of masculinity, can be tempered by fostering and promoting healthy masculinity. This is why there has been a push to eradicate the harmful expectations and stereotypes our society teaches boys about what it means to be a man. We will take a look at norms associated with traditional constructs of masculinity and how they have been implicated in the creation of environments where men's violence against women, girls, and other men has been normalized and accepted. We will briefly summarize ways to combat the perpetuation of these harmful norms, and our guest speakers will discuss the meaning of healthy masculinity and how it relates to sexual violence prevention and health promotion. So for our first interactive text chat question, we want to know, what are some harmful notions of masculinity that enable, promote, and condone violence? So please type your responses in the text chat window. Only the presenters can see your answers, but I'll read them aloud as they come through. Okay, so Eric's saying he hits you because he likes you. Veronica said that masculinity equals domination. That's definitely a good point, and we'll talk about that more later on in the webinar. Christine says that somehow men are different than women and not at all human. That's another really great point, and although we're talking about unhealthy masculinity and ways that men can use their strength in an unhealthy way, we definitely don't want to villainize them or isolate them. Jackie says women like to be physically pursued for sex, like it to be forceful. That's definitely a misconception that some people have. Whitney says he's jealous of other men when he truly loves you. And Catherine says anger is the only acceptable emotion for men to express. So that last one is definitely something that we're going to address, and we're going to speak about how men have been socialized to replace certain emotions with anger and dominance. So now we're going to talk about David and Brannon's 4 themes of masculinity, which have been used to describe traditional masculine sexuality as aggressive, dominant, and goal-oriented. Literature suggests that in areas with a high prevalence and incidence of rape, there actually tends to be a high endorsement of the macho persona and hypermasculinity. Likewise, Mernon et al. Found that there is a consistent relationship between men's adherence to sexist, patriarchal, and/or sexually hostile attitudes and sexual violence. Hypermasculinity, in which men believe that violence is manly and danger is exciting, and hostile masculinity, in which men strive to be in control and have a defensive or distrustful orientation towards women, are both characterized by sexually calloused attitudes towards women and are tied to sexual violence. In fact, those who fit the hypermasculinity description had higher self-report of sexual aggression. Other studies have linked gender role stereotyping and rape myth acceptance to sexual violence, and both of these predictors tend to be more prevalent in patriarchal societies where there is strict adherence to traditional masculinity ideals. Research has shown that men with more traditional, rigid, and misogynistic gender role attitudes are more likely to practice marital violence. In general, traditional gender role orientations have been associated with greater acceptance and perpetration of violence against women. A sense of male entitlement also plays a role. Research has shown that boys and young men who endorse more rape-supportive ideas and beliefs are more likely to have been sexually coercive. In fact, a nationwide 2001 National Crime Prevention Survey of 5,000 young people aged 12 to 20 found that 14% of males agreed with the following statement: "It's okay for a boy to make a girl have sex with him if she has flirted or led him on." Even the common baseball analogy that is so often used to describe sex and is so pervasive is an example of how boys have been socially conditioned to treat sex as a game that must be mastered and won. Sexual assault awareness campaigns typically have tended to target potential victims and instruct them on how not to get raped, as opposed to teaching potential perps to not rape. Not only does this ignore the root cause of the problem, but it often leads to victim blaming after the assault. However, in recent years, sexual assault prevention has evolved from merely educating women on how to stay safe to also shifting the focus to men to take responsibility for their behavior. Stopping abuse is not a she issue, but a we issue. Changing the traditional concept of masculinity and reinventing it so that it doesn't enable misogyny has become an essential component of the healthy masculinity movement. In a recent article, Jacqueline Friedman points out that traditional masculinity is also harmful and constraining to men because the anxiety of being ridiculed or shamed for expressing fear, compassion, and vulnerability hinders personal growth. Other research suggests that feelings such as excitement and anger are socialized to replace more so-called inferior feminine feelings such as distress and fear. Men are taught, don't be scared, don't cry, don't show weakness, be brave, be tough, be daring. As former NFL quarterback and self-proclaimed feminist Don McPherson put it, we don't raise boys to be men. We raise them not to be women or gay men. Sadly, because toxic masculinity is so deeply entrenched in our societal norms, those who dare to go against the status quo run the risk of social shaming or actual don't be a fag violence. The majority of men aren't prone to violence, and many want to be part of the solution. This is why it is so important to foster an environment where boys are encouraged to redefine masculinity in a way that is not predicated on dominance or violence. So for our next question, I'd like you all to type into the text chat window how you define healthy masculinity. What does it mean to you? Okay, so Catherine says, freedom to experience and express a full range of human emotions, freedom to be vulnerable in relationships. That's definitely a good point, and as we said before, typically boys are socialized to replace so-called more feminine emotions and display those with others. Okay, Sarah said having respect for everyone and respectful emotional responses. And Melissa said to be understanding. All right, great. Thank you for answering that question. Okay, so our next slide discusses defining healthy masculinity and how to talk about it with boys and young men. So when talking about masculinity, it's important to keep 5 critical themes in mind. For many boys and men, it might be the first time they've been asked about this topic, and it might be difficult for them to make the initial connection between violence against women and healthy masculinity. It's important to meet them where they're at. In other words, avoid making assumptions or attempting to sway them in a specific direction. Your role should not consist of telling them they're wrong, but it is okay to challenge their ideas in order to engage them and to force them to think critically about what healthy masculinity actually means. Although it might be tempting to convince your male audience to adopt your personal definition of masculinity, try not to influence their opinions. The point is to help males think critically about the concept and to help them feel comfortable exploring alternative notions of masculinity. Your goal is to help them see other options so they can consciously make their own decision. You should also ask males to identify healthy masculinity role models and have them explain why these people were chosen. Ask them how these men show strength in their relationships and how they treat people. Helping them to see how the men they respect do not fit the stereotypical mold of masculinity will help expand their understanding of the concept. We actually joined forces with Columbia social work students who conducted a survey that asked this very question. The results and process of that will be discussed briefly later on, time permitting. But essentially, most of the respondents who were approached chose males who they knew personally to be their healthy masculinity role model. So people who provided care, wisdom, guidance, or support. However, many of the respondents had difficulty grasping and understanding the question. Many asked for clarification, which suggested that the subject of healthy masculinity may be abstract. So as I said in the first bullet point, sometimes it's hard for people to make the connection between healthy masculinity and violence, and even more of an issue is the fact that some people don't even know what healthy masculinity means. They've never talked about it. They've never been exposed to it. And the study that we did with Columbia actually illustrated this in that it just seemed like such a foreign concept. Perhaps this stems from the fact that until recently this topic was somewhat absent from our culture. Men don't frequently celebrate healthy role models, whereas for women, counter storytelling is much more prominent. If you think about headlines, magazine articles, and workshops for young girls, a lot of these focus on awesome and radical and strong female role models and girls who are, paving the way for other women, and that's not something that we typically see for men. So the next thing that we advise you to do in discussing healthy masculinity is to talk about how the ideal man is portrayed in the media and the ways in which this ideal differs from the role models listed above. So what qualities and attributes are lauded by the media versus what qualities do you value and do you hold to be the ideal of healthy masculinity? We also recommend that you discuss how conventions of traditional masculinity have helped to normalize negative behaviors such as street harassment, objectification of women, sense of sexual entitlement, and use of physical intimidation. So while traditional masculinity does not necessarily always lead to violence, it does support male domination of others, which I think someone mentioned before in the text chat, that unhealthy masculinity is usually associated with dominance. It's important for boys to understand that socially sanctioned behaviors that stem from male domination, such as street harassment and the things that we mentioned before, are often a precursor to violent behavior. It also creates this permissive culture where violence is excused and victims are blamed, and the whole boys will be boys adage is used to explain away harmful and destructive behavior. Finally, many men who refrain from violence think that that's enough, but males should be encouraged to play an active role in eliminating violence. Sharing statistics about domestic violence and sexual abuse can help males see that violence is more pervasive than they think. Also, it really helps to discuss ways to get involved. I think it's really useful to try to galvanize people and let them know that there are ways that they can get involved and different activities that they can partake in order to change harmful social norms. Many people don't know about these opportunities, so it's really key to provide some guidance and expose them to the different opportunities that are available. So on this slide, we discuss some important aspects of healthy masculinity that practitioners should emphasize when discussing the concept. Attention should be paid to recognizing unhealthy aspects of masculinity and identifying why these are unhealthy. Go further and help your audience to come up with ways to counteract these conventional norms and behaviors. Many programs that work with men begin with an exploration of rape culture, but they tend not to offer concrete ways for men to deconstruct rape culture in their personal lives. So as I mentioned on the last slide, a lot of men don't really know how to address the issue or be part of the solution. So healthy masculinity problems should really build on men's willingness to be part of the solution to end sexual violence and engage them as allies. So again, reinforcing this point, it's really important to mobilize men as allies and get them involved. Given all of the supportive evidence, it's clear that cultivating a sense of healthy masculinity is crucial for healthy social norms promotion and violence prevention. In this next section, we'll discuss healthy masculinity approaches to sexual violence prevention and social norms change. So some of the things that we'll discuss are different social marketing campaigns by Men Can Stop Rape and SAVE, which is a Canadian organization. Some initiatives, specifically the Healthy Masculinity Action Project, and they just held a summit in the fall. And our guest speaker, Q, will discuss Connect Men's programming later on in the webinar. Social marketing campaigns have actually been proven to be pretty effective and are largely based on the social norms approach, which posits that people tend to have unrealistic assumptions about the social behaviors of others, and they use these assumptions to guide their own decisions and actions. The impact of these campaigns has been well documented in other public health arenas, specifically substance abuse. For instance, most college students have been found to overestimate the amount of alcohol that other college students drink, and then they use this misperception to explain their own drinking behavior. Studies on sexual violence suggest a similar outcome in that males are heavily influenced by their beliefs about others' actions and their beliefs. Men tend to underestimate the value that others place on consent and the willingness of men to intervene against sexual violence, and men's adherence to consensual sexual activity is largely impacted by their perceptions of norms. As a result, social marketing campaigns are a valuable tool in helping to change misperceptions of norms. The campaign run by Men Can Stop Rape seeks to mobilize men to act as social justice allies in preventing sexual and domestic violence. My Strength is Not for Hurting and Where Do You Stand both challenge traditional ideas of masculinity while trying to encourage activism through bystander intervention and denouncement of unhealthy masculinity, dominance, power, and aggression. A similar behavioral marketing campaign called Don't Be That Guy also recognizes the need for social norms change, healthy masculinity, and male accountability. Distribution of these posters began after a surge in alcohol-related sexual assaults, and a study cited by the campaign showed that an alarming 48% of 18 to 25-year-old men surveyed did not consider it rape if a woman was too drunk to know what was going on. These ads challenge aspects of traditional masculinity and harmful social norms, specifically the sense of entitlement in regards to sex and access to women's bodies. So as you can see in the first one, the guy is helping the girl home, and you can read the message there. Just because you help her home doesn't mean you get to help yourself. And basically the point of this social marketing campaign is just to tell guys, like, don't be guilty of, succumbing to traditional notions of masculinity where there's feelings of entitlement for sex. So the Healthy Masculinity Project is a 2-year national initiative that seeks to raise awareness on how healthy masculinity intersects with sexual violence prevention and overall well-being. The movement is spearheaded by Washington, D.C.-based Men Can Stop Rape in collaboration with 5 other well-known gender-based violence prevention organizations and 35 other allies. The objective is to develop resources, best practices, and educational tools to promote healthy nonviolent masculinity, including specific action plans for engaging men and boys in violence prevention. The Healthy Masculinity Summit was held in October 2012 and kicked off the official start of HMAP. Hundreds of industry leaders from various sectors met to strategize on ways to engage men and boys on healthy masculinity. With keynote speeches such as "What is healthy masculinity and how can it benefit our lives?" the summit explored how healthy masculinity can positively impact society. In addition to the summit, the movement will also consist of town hall meetings facilitated by HMAP Training Institute leaders. The Healthy Masculinity Training Institute will be a 3-day intensive training on healthy masculinity awareness to action held in Atlanta, Georgia in June. It will mobilize HMAP ambassadors and equip them with tools to present in schools and local forums on the importance of healthy, nonviolent masculinity. In October 2013, the Youth Leadership Summit will bring together young men to collaborate and develop healthy masculinity action plans for implementation in schools nationwide. The summit relies heavily on using storytelling and awareness and action breakout conversations instead of lectures and presentations. HMAP organizers will use the anecdotal data collected throughout the summit to create a body of knowledge that will shape future work. The diagram on the slide illustrates some of the topics discussed with relation to healthy masculinity. Several take-home points were that when it comes to fatherhood, many men feel more comfortable showing their love through financial assistance rather than through physical and emotional support. On that same plane, religious traditions and cultural beliefs can influence masculinity with their dominant stories of what the stereotyped man's role should be in his home and community. Finally, unhealthy masculinity persists within the workplace and educational institutions, particularly when you notice that both textbooks and bosses often sensationalize and reward the more aggressive, powerful, and/or successful leaders. Obviously, the definition of healthy masculinity may vary across culture, creed, race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation, which is why healthy masculinity programming must be culturally competent and sensitive to the needs of its specific audience. For the most part, practitioners tend to think about healthy masculinity and sexual violence within what we call a heteronormative gender binary context. In other words, we think about it in a male-female way. However, it's important to consider adapting the idea of healthy masculinity to be more inclusive of other experiences and other types of relationships. Sexual violence can also occur within same-sex relationships, and all individuals, regardless of sexual orientation, can benefit from healthy gender identity. Moreover, sexual violence can be perpetrated simply because an individual doesn't fit into socially constructed and assigned gender roles, and our guest speaker, Jared, will speak more about this later. Historically, certain groups, for example, male athletes, have been pressured to subscribe to ideas of hyper-masculinity. Those who don't abide by these rules are often stigmatized and ostracized. Recently, 2 high-profile professional male athletes, Robbie Rogers of the LA Galaxy and basketball star Jason Collins, made headlines after both revealed that they are gay. These events have begun to provoke discussions on what it means to redefine traditional notions of masculinity. Hopefully, people are reevaluating and rethinking the way that masculinity has been defined in the past. Earlier I mentioned the SAVE campaign, which has since recognized the need for more inclusive social marketing and now features an ad specific to male homosexual relationships, and that's pictured on the right. In this same vein, our first guest speaker, Jared Ringer of the New York City Anti-Violence Project, will discuss the intersection of masculinity, gender roles, and sexual violence within the LGBTQH community. So we'd like to take a moment to welcome our first guest speaker, Jared Ringer, Hate, Violence, and Sexual Relations Program Coordinator at the New York City Anti-Violence Project. And he will discuss how healthy masculinity relates to the specific audience that his organization serves.
Thank you. Please stand by.
Thanks, Joanna, and to the Alliance for setting up this training. I'm really honored and privileged to be participating in this webinar today, and thanks so much to Q. It's really great to be presenting with you. So my name is Jared Ringer, and I'm the coordinator of the Hate, Violence, and Sexual Violence programs at the New York City Anti-Violence Project. And we have been around for over 30 years, and we started as an all-volunteer organization in 1980 in response to a series of anti-gay attacks against gay men in the Chelsea neighborhood of Manhattan. We became a nonprofit organization in 1984. We primarily serve the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and HIV-affected communities. In addition to addressing issues around hate violence, we also address issues of intimate partner violence, sexual violence, police institutional violence, hookup and online dating violence, as well as HIV-related violence. And on my slide, we have our mission. We're also nationally recognized as experts on best practices when working with LGBTQH survivors of violence. The New York City Anti-Violence Project works from a systems approach to the work. So we work on addressing issues and prevention around violence both from a micro, meso, and macro approach. And we have two programmatic departments. We have our Client Services Department and our Community Organizing Department. And in our Client Services Department, we have a 24-hour bilingual English-Spanish hotline. We provide individual counseling as well as support groups. We have an intimate partner violence legal clinic. We do a lot of shelter advocacy work in addition to general advocacy. We do accompaniments to hospitals, precincts, courts, the DA's offices, as well as medical and mental health services. And we also support survivors with filing applications for Office of Victim Services. And we also do a lot of community organizing and public advocacy work through our Community Organizing Department. We do have an Education and Training Institute. We do a lot of rapid incident responses to incidents of violence. We do a lot of coalition and collaborative work involved in movement building. We have a Speakers Bureau program. We train folks for our hotline, and they become DOH rape crisis counselors certified after they complete the training. And we also coordinate the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs, which is a program of the New York City Anti-Violence Project, which is made up of over 40 local anti-violence projects throughout the United States and 2 in Canada. In addition, AVP provides community-based counseling services throughout the 5 boroughs, in addition to the outreach that we do all across New York City. We're at the Brooklyn Family Justice Center, the Bronx Family Justice Center, Staten Island LGBT Community Center, and Make the Road in Queens, in addition to our collaboration with Citywide Harm Reduction Community Healthcare Network and Bronx Aid Services in the Bronx, which primarily serves transgender women of color. So what I'm going to talk about is how LGBTQ communities are impacted by sexual violence, along with the influence of gender roles and expectations around the narrow definitions that our culture and society has of masculinity. And we very much work from an anti-oppression approach, and with the understanding of how intersectionality plays into the experiences of violence that our communities face. So just to begin, I just want to review some of the language and terminology that we use here at AVP, and my guess is that many folks on the call or on the webinar have an understanding of LGBTQ identities and communities. So this is just the standard acronym that we use at the Anti-Violence Project. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, in addition to HIV-affected folks. And so lesbian, gay, bisexual is connected to sexual orientation. Transgender identity or identities is an umbrella term that we use that's inclusive of many different gender identities and gender expression. And queer is a term that has more recently been used by many more community members to identify either their sexual orientation and or gender identity. It's more of a political term in terms of reclaiming a word that had been previously used in a derogatory way against community members. So in talking about violence, and specifically sexual violence in LGBTQ communities, we really focus on the definitions of sex and gender, or the binary gender system that our culture and society has, and the enforcement of that rigid binary gender definition and expectations of roles and expression of gender. So why is this important? There are limited traditional ideas about sex and gender. In particular, culture and society strictly define these roles. High levels of violence and discrimination happen to LGBTQ individuals who do not follow traditional gender roles. Most homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic attitudes stem from the assumptions around gender and sex. And we really emphasize that knowing this increases our abilities to assist and support LGBTQ survivors of violence. Specifically, when we're looking at misogyny and healthy masculinity, it's important to note the influences of heteromisogyny, patriarchy, sexism, as well as transmisogyny, patriarchy, and sexism, and the influence and the impact that these forms of oppression have within LGBTQ communities, in particular amongst cisgender gay men or non-transgender gay men. There is lots of rigid definitions of masculinity within gay male culture. There's a kind of a priority or premium that's put on to gay men who follow traditional masculine roles, and lots of critiques and criticism of gay men who fall outside of that rigid definition of masculinity. So more effeminate gay men often face discrimination within gay male communities. There's also issues within the community around gay male relationships with lesbian and bisexual women, as well as transgender women and transgender men. So there is definitely a significant impact, and we see this play out in, as well as intimate partner violence and sexual violence, the impact that that has on folks. So in defining sex, we talk about sex being assigned at birth based on biological and physiological characteristics that define both men and women. So primary sex characteristics such as genitalia, penis, testes, vagina, as well as uterus and ovaries, the chromosomes, XX, XY is influencing the primary sex characteristics, and hormones, so testosterone, estrogen. And then we also, as a culture and society, look at secondary sex characteristics in defining roles and expectations of gender. So facial hair, height, body mass, vocal range, the way we dress, the types of jobs that we have, the people that we have romantic, physical, emotional, spiritual, intellectual relationships with, right? So men are expected to have sex with women and be in relationships with women, and vice versa. This is a quote from Ricky Ann Wilkins, who is a longtime transgender activist, and it really speaks to the socialization, gender socialization that we experience based on the sex that we're assigned at birth. I'm not going to read the quote, but you guys will have that in the slide from the presentation. The way that ABP defines or looks at gender identity is that this is unique to every individual, that a person's gender identity may not always match the sex that they were assigned at birth. And the term that is used when assigned sex does not match a person's gender identity or gender expression is transgender. And within transgender, as I mentioned before, that's an umbrella term. So we have gender nonconforming folks and the various continuum of gender identity and gender expression under that umbrella. So what is gender? Gender refers to the socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities, characteristics, etc., that our society considers appropriate for men and women. So again, the gender binary system. We define sexual orientation as about who you are romantically, sexually, emotionally, intellectually, or spiritually attracted to. And gender identity is about how you understand your own gender and how you express that. And this is just another slide, again, that kind of reviews transgender identities as an umbrella term, and just to reinforce that it describes people whose way of understanding and expressing their own gender is different from what society expects. And I've mentioned other gender identities that fall within that umbrella, right? So gender nonconforming folks, genderqueer identity, two-spirit people. And also it's important to note that transitioning is unique for every individual. People may use different pronouns, hormones may be taken, dressing may differ. Someone might change their name. Not everyone who is trans-identified has surgery. Some folks do. So this varies across the gender spectrum. So just quickly, what is oppression? And we use a definition from the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. So oppression is a pattern or system of inequality which gives power and privilege to one group of people at the expense of another. So where there is a group of folks who are in power, and in our culture and society this is primarily white, heterosexual Christian men, and when you add some type of prejudice against a marginalized group or identity or identities, it results in various forms of oppression, including homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, racism, sexism, ableism, ageism, classism, heterosexism, ethnocentrism, etc. We do, as I mentioned earlier, very much work from an approach or an understanding of intersectionality, and that many of the folks that we work with, in addition to their sexual orientation and or gender identity, are also experiencing these other forms of oppression. And in fact, the research that we and the data that we collect shows that transgender women in particular, transgender women of color, experience disproportionate rates of violence and more severe forms of violence, and are more likely to experience hate violence or sexual violence, and are often profiled as sex workers and experience hate and sexual violence from various institutions, including the police. So some of the forms of discrimination that we see as a result of oppression, I just read down that list, which is on the slide, as well as the different levels, right? So interpersonal experiences of discrimination and oppression or microaggressions, community forms of discrimination, and then institutional and political systems that enforce various forms of oppression. so again, some of the examples that we use for discrimination, using anti-LGBTQ slurs or harassment, family rejection, outing someone, hate violence, sexual violence, intimate partner violence. I mentioned profiling of LGBTQ people, access to health care and mental health care, issues with criminal legal systems, as well as the various social services that folks may experience discrimination, hate violence from. So in terms of sexual violence and discrimination in this about LGBTQ communities, LGBTQ folks are often identified as outsiders, sexual deviants, and are scapegoated as perpetrators of sexual violence. Therefore, they may face discrimination when seeking or asking for help. Homophobia and heterosexism in our culture puts LGBTQ people at greater risk for sexual violence. And it's common for perpetrators to use sexual violence as a way to punish and humiliate someone for being LGBTQ. And a common example of this is corrective rape. And this most often happens when a lesbian or bisexual woman experiences rape and sexual assault perpetrated by men as a way of quote-unquote changing their sexual orientation. And this is quite widespread, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, but certainly we see examples and cases of this in the United States with a recent incident a few years ago that made a lot of that received a lot of media attention, where a lesbian woman was entering her car in San Francisco, and she had a pride flag on her car, and a group of men pulled her out of her car and raped her over a course of hours as a way of changing her sexual orientation, quote unquote. And then there's just various assumptions about, additional assumptions, again, about LGBTQ folks, that they're pedophiles, promiscuous, or asexual freaks, or inherently abusive involving strange sexual practices, or they're just people who have just had bad experiences with the opposite sex. There is fetishization of identities, in particular in heterosexual male communities of lesbian and bisexual women, as well as transgender women. And then there are these assumptions impact how LGBTQ-related sexual violence incidents are treated by first responders, medical staff, and mental health professionals. So that concludes my PowerPoint presentation, and I know that we did receive a question about male privilege being a component of sexual violence, and how is this explained when you're looking at same-sex relationships and intimate partner violence in particular, when we're talking about lesbian women. And I certainly would agree that male privilege is a component of sexual violence, but when we're talking about intimate partner violence, certainly we really approach that as a pattern of power and control, which is similar to heterosexual relationships, but also so that we use that often as an explanation when it comes to intimate partner violence. But we do, and also it changes our concepts of who an offender is, right? So we, traditionally we think men as being offenders of sexual violence and perpetrating that against women, but certainly women can be offenders of sexual violence and intimate partner violence, and we certainly see that among same-sex couples and stranger sexual violence as well. So thanks so much, and I really, again, appreciate all the work that Joanna and the Alliance has done in putting this webinar together, and I am excited to hear Q's presentation, and thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Please stand by.
Quentin Q. Walcott, Co-Executive Director of Connect NYC and recipient of Now NYC's 2012 Susan B. Anthony Award. Welcome, Q.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you to Jared, co-presenter, and I'd like to thank Mary Haviland and most importantly all the participants for joining us for this conversation. Okay, I'll just kind of jump right into it. I have 6 quick slides, but I just wanted to kind of tell you what Connect's mission is. Connect is dedicated to preventing interpersonal violence and promoting gender justice by building partnerships with individuals and communities we strive to help change the beliefs, behaviors, and institutions that perpetuate violence through legal empowerment, grassroots mobilization, and transformative education. We seek to create safe families and peaceful communities. I'm going to concentrate on Connect Men today, but I just want to quickly go over some of the programs that we have at Connect. And the main program, which all of the programs kind of fall under, is the Community Empowerment Program. And in that, we have Connect Training Institute, where we train. This year alone, we've trained 650 people to either work with abusive men and boys, women and girls who are survivors or victims of violence, and also children who witness violence. We have a Connect Men program, which I'll get into in a few minutes. We also have a Connect Women and Girls program, where we really seek to empower and celebrate the wisdom and resilience of women through education and support and healing. We have a separate Connect Youth program as well, which enlightens girls and engages boys through empowerment training, self-esteem building, while educating them on dating, gang, and domestic violence prevention strategies. And we have a Connect Faith program, which I really want to kind of highlight, because a lot of our work really started with engaging faith communities, and our goal is really to collaborate with diverse faith communities to create strength in response to gender and family violence. And then we have a direct service piece, which is really our only direct service piece, is our legal advocacy program, where we assist victims of domestic violence and sexual violence with law enforcement and judicial responses to the incidents of the abuse that they experience. So those are quickly the Connect programs. But I'm here today to talk about really the work that we do with men and engaging men and boys. And, Connect developed a strategy to engage men and boys because we felt that, one, it was important to really look at, survivors and their relationships. Most, as you know, most domestic violence and sexual violence goes unreported. And then with that, many survivors and victims of domestic violence do not leave those abusive relationships immediately. Some don't leave at all. Some leave and come back, leave and come back. And then some, do leave if the, support is in place and, they can be safe when they leave the relationship. So with that thinking, we felt that it was important to engage men and boys. In the cases that, women don't leave or children are kind of like, still witnessing the violence that they experience in the home. So as a strategy, we felt that it was important to keep women and children safe by working and engaging with men and boys. And then secondly, to kind of, help change and transform the attitudes and belief systems that perpetuate the violence that they experience, that they perpetrate in their relationships and in the community. So with that, we've developed several programs that we call male anti-violence initiatives that engage men to the point that was spoken earlier in terms of meeting men where they are. I like to kind of frame that in meeting men at their masculinity. And, so masculinity, we consider as an attitude or a mask that's kind of put on depending on the environment that they're in, or, and that is also fed in and fueled by their belief system. So we have several initiatives that we've developed over the course of 10 years, and we're in our 10th year now as an organization. And I'm just going to really kind of read through these briefly because I think they're important, and I'll concentrate on the top three. The Men and Women as Allies program that we developed with Cornell University and CWA, Communication Workers of America, local unions 1106 and 1108, where we approached, and this is again meeting men where they are, they're in the workplace, looking at workplace violence, domestic violence, and bullying behavior, and looking at how those things intersect, and at the core of those things being power and control. And a lot of intimate partner violence happens in the workplace. That's either developed on a workplace or shows up as a result of it happening in the home. So we felt that as a strategy, it was important to kind of really embrace men where they are and develop men and women as active bystanders in that process to really engage, men from being the perpetrator or the victim of violence, and also for women who are, victims of violence and also experiencing violence in home and also in the workplace and how that kind of shows up. And then we have several programs that we're really looking outside of the box of the traditional methods of dealing with domestic violence and sexual violence, outside of the typical systems, because as you all know, most is unreported. So we have to kind of figure out ways of helping people who are not dealing with traditional systems to do that. So we're developing restorative justice partnerships with organizations and really looking at community circles and circles of accountability, and also working with alternative to incarceration programs, and really making that link between people who experience violence and particularly witness violence, get involved with other forms of community violence and making that intersection for them. So that's important. And also I'll work with reaching out to abusive fathers and men and young men through our training. We have in-depth intensive training looking at how teaching people in the community, professionals and non-professionals, how to really engage fathers who have been abusive in their relationship and young men and what have you. So all of our training is really a reflection of manhood, masculinity, entitlement, privilege, and also how we're socialized as men and boys in society, and what that has to do with different forms of violence. So the three pieces that I really wanted to concentrate on today that really demonstrate our work in engaging men and boys and looking at sexual violence and domestic violence and other forms of violence is firstly is we have a group called Hombres Delegando for men who are undocumented or documented here in New York City who are experiencing different forms of xenophobia, racism, other forms of oppressions that they experience just in their day-to-day lives in New York City. But at the same time, they're feeling hopeless and powerless. They go home in their relationships where they feel entitled and they feel that they're in a position of power to really abuse their families and particularly their intimate partners, and also not just through domestic violence and physical violence and psychological violence, but a lot of that is also connected to rape and also other forms of sexual violence. So we developed this program, which has been running for about 4 or 5 years now, where we look at the issues that they're facing, either from being a man, their struggles with their masculinity based on their cultural beliefs and ethnic beliefs around how they are positioned in society, and particularly in their relationships and their families. So the struggles that they have with that, also the issues around fatherhood, and also about what it means to be in their relationships here in the United States, or really coming with heavy, entrenched cultural beliefs around how they should, gender roles and their positions in their families. So we meet with them and really kind of look at their experiences around violence, where they are in a position, where they're not in a position of power, and relate that to where they are in a position of power in terms of their relationships at home and in their communities. So a lot of that conversation is really for them, their experiences around racism, and then them not being, benefits of that, and they're oppressed by, systems of race, system of race. And then also kind of for them to understand that they do have power in terms of sexism and in terms of relationships. So to have that conversation with them around sexism and domestic violence and sexual violence is really to talk to them about race, where they don't have power and where they do have power. So that's a really effective tool around having conversations around healthy and unhealthy masculinity and coming from a cultural context as well. So that's very important. And then we have a program, a manhood development series for young men that we've been doing, where we reach out to, sadly, we reach out to middle schools, high schools, and also college campuses, and then, young men who are, of school age and not necessarily in traditional schools. So we have this Reinventing Manhood project, which we call REMAP, and we've been doing that for many years, but recently we got a grant from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to really look at how can we engage men and boys in single-gender groups in high schools and charter schools, and have this conversation around. Let me actually skip to that slide here, where we engage them around these critical conversations, and really developing and transforming their ideas around manhood, masculinity, entitlement, in terms of how we're socialized to be men and young men in society, and really developing a critical consciousness around that, and looking at that through a race lens, class lens, sexual orientation, and trying to really developing an agenda analysis and teach them critical thinking around some of these belief systems that we're kind of born in and we benefit from in society. So that's very, very important. That's a very, very important project. And using video game design as a way of having these conversations, because as you all know, and many people on this webinar, play video games. No matter how old you are and how young you are, but video games, just like other forms of media, are very powerful in a sense of really developing and establishing the ways that men and women should show up in society or do show up in society. And a lot of times, media, and not just hip-hop music or just any form of music, if you look at the lyrics or you look at videos and how women and girls show up, women and girls show up and how men and boys show up in that. So it's important. We do a lot of that using, media and pop culture, and then using this method of really having these young men designing their own video game. So with that, we build a lot of empathy, and we do a lot of workshops first to really get them to the place where they can, look at where they are in the community, how masculinity shows up for them, what are the detriments of masculinity, and what are some positives of masculinity, which is important because when you think about some of the young men that we're encountering, and these are very disadvantaged young men who are living in communities where they face racism and different forms of poverty, and also living in working class families, poor families, communities of color, and many families that are really struggling to really live and work at a livable wage. So we use all of those experiences around their communities, their growing up, their histories of violence in their families, and really have these conversations around what does that mean for you, how does that explain your environment, the culture that you're in, and also the decisions that they make. And one thing that we found was that about 80% of the young people who are involved in gun and gang violence, and there's a huge relationship to sexual violence in terms of gang initiation and group rape and individual rape involved in that culture as well. So we make that connection for them, that many of these young children who are witnessing violence at home are not getting the things that they need, so they're making poor decisions in the community. And gang members, like many of us on this call and this webinar, ask the same questions that we ask. Are you hungry? Do you need a place to stay? Do you have money in your pocket? But, at the cost of usually a young woman or a young man who doesn't fit into this real comfortable masculinity box. So we really put that in perspective and really try to challenge them and talk about accountability and what that looks like, and putting in perspective for them. And some of the things that they share with us is that their struggles when we have these conversations about masculinity, and which is very important, is really language. So we may not use the term masculinity, but we get to the same point in terms of the attitude and our belief system in terms of how they demonstrate their manhood in different scenarios and situations. So some of these young men, they talk about how they can, demonstrate different forms, and I like to say masculinities because it's really it's not just one form of masculinity, but when they demonstrate unhealthy forms of masculinity, sometimes they really express that in the sense that they are being defensive or being strategic around displaying hypermasculinity on unhealthy forms of masculinity as a safety measure, so they can navigate their communities, and also the things that they have to kind of navigate as well is that how they are around other men. So a lot of it is around navigating so they can simply get home at the end of the day. The experiences around, I think Jared mentioned stop and frisk, but that's just the latest. But in terms of their relationships with the police and police brutality, so that's about demonstrating at certain times unhealthy forms of masculinity as a defense measure. So it's really that's why I say it's important to really meet young men and boys at their masculinity, so we have an understanding of where they are, where they're coming from, and how are they navigating that. So, and then at home, if all things being safe at home, they can drop that mask and demonstrate more healthy forms of masculinity and, at their home relationships or in their intimate partner relationships. And a lot of times, the masculinity is also looked at as a rite of passage, and particularly unhealthy forms of masculinity because of their male cohort that they're with. And one thing that we've also found is that in terms of looking at healthy masculinity is that a lot of these young men do not feel what happens in the group is right. They feel that the treatment of women through street harassment to sexual violence or even physical forms of violence and domestic violence is incorrect, but sometimes they feel like, if they come outside of that box, so to speak, that they will become victims of violence as well for standing up for someone that they feel is a human being as much as they are. So there's a lot of navigating of masculinity and healthy and unhealthy that comes out of doing this work with these young men. So, and I just wanted to go back so you can see the HD group that we call HD, where these young men, these really men who are from 18 to, I think the oldest person we've had in one of our groups is about 68 years old. So it's multi-generational, and they learn from different experiences. And that these, some of these men are psychiatrists or doctors in their home countries, but here, because their accreditation is not considered to be valid, they're relegated to different forms and jobs. So that creates a lot of frustration for them. They take that out on their families.
Q, somebody had a question about how men become involved in that program.
Well, we have, so a lot of it is multiple ways of doing that. We, through our community empowerment program, where we have, coordinators and educators that go out and do work in the communities, training with organizations and faith institutions, and, myself, I do that as well. So a lot of it is word of mouth because it's an alternative to the traditional batterist program where you're mandated to go. So we're really kind of developing these community models because, one, most violence is not reported, and then the very few that end up in some form of group or program, that's a very small percentage. So we're trying to really create ways of, scanning the communities. We actually, sometimes we walk the community, we talk to someone. We have like over 150 community partners. We in dialogue with our community partners, and we let them know what we're doing. And then we also try to work the men that we do work with. We push them and encourage them to really bring other men from their own communities in. So that's some of the ways we do that. And we also have some partnerships with like Common Justice in Brooklyn. So we're doing work. A lot of those young men are involved with the criminal justice system or, have some form of crime, but we've kind of really worked with them to really figure out that, domestic violence and sexual violence is a core component of why these young men are involved with the state in that way. So we have, multiple forms of doing that. We do outreach, of course, and but really through our work over the 10 years in developing relationships and communities, we're able to kind of find these men to really be engaged in these projects or through our community partners. So another strategy was to really, funny enough, one of the most popular domestic violence cases was the Chris Brown-Rihanna situation. And with that, from doing this work for many years, I heard a lot of misinformation about what was happening in that case of violence. So what I thought was important was to try to find a way where people who are who don't really or are not involved with domestic violence or sexual violence organizations, they probably see more DV and sexual violence than we do. So I felt that it was important that, find a way of having these conversations and broadening the network of people who are, in particular, working with men and women by developing this men's roundtable. And we're really closing out our fourth year of the men's roundtable, and each month having an opportunity to really engage men who work with men and boys in any capacity to have these conversations around masculinity, to talk about entitlement, accountability, privilege, All of these things that really show up in day-to-day lives that, they may not have the language or the experience around, but they're dealing with this with their clients or through their customers or through the young men or adult men that they're working with. So we developed this as a platform to bring, people from the field and, from varying degrees of consciousness around, the women's movement or violence against women or sexual violence or domestic violence to come together, and we just kind of really hash out a lot of these ideas and themes and things that come up in everyday life, and always looking at how can we struggle with accountability and what does accountability mean? Can we as men hold each other accountable? What role does our allies and relationships with women play a role in terms of holding us accountable and modeling behavior? So, a lot of our work with men is really to kind of really push and encourage and really transform perpetrators, because there's a lot of perpetrators out there that aren't connected to any systems and are continue to commit violence in all forms of violence and aren't getting the help that they need. So really engaging abusers, perpetrators, lack of a better word, people who are doing harm, and also bystanders who are, I think even more important than looking at perpetrators and abusers, because if they're just kind of standing by and not really stepping up to the plate and saying that, what's happening is wrong, or is either that they don't care or they're benefiting. And I always say that, bystanders benefit from the abusers or people who are perpetrating harm more than the actual perpetrators themselves, because just in terms of how society is and how we show up, because we benefit from that in terms of instilling fear and, just this entitlement that we have in society, even if we don't step up and say what's happening is wrong. So we're really pushing to move men from bystanders to allies with women and ultimately activists on our own. And the ally piece is very important for men and women to ally with women and girls, and just like, race movements in terms of blacks, people of color, allying with white folks, and then, gay, straight alliances, those are important, and also transgender communities and other forms of alliances are all important in terms of really progressing and moving people to a different place. So that's one of our major goals, and like even demonstrating through our leadership here at Connect, having co-executive directors, Sally McNichol and I worked together for many years, but now we're in this leadership position because we found that through our work and working with communities around healthy masculinity and what does that really look like, is that it's important that, men and women ally. And so that's the approach that we're taking at Connect is, we're become co-executive directors so we can really demonstrate and really work out what does accountability mean, what does safety mean, how can men and women, not only engaging men and women, but how can they work together. So that's another important piece. So these are just different strategies that we use. The men's roundtable is one. We also have a women's roundtable. And the new piece that we pulled together is like, so instead of, and I think it's important to have these separate spaces to talk about masculinity and violence and sexual violence. It's important to have those separate spaces. But then one thing that we've done now is created these community dialogues, which we have, I believe it's the second Thursday every month, where we, have men and women come together and really kind of hash out and talk about how do we show up in each other's lives, how can we really develop these alliances, and really, so it's an opportunity to kind of bring what we talk about separately together in a really, it's informal, but it's, facilitated, it's great facilitation. Sally and I do that ourselves, to really have these conversations around, what is healthy, what is unhealthy, about relationships, about sex, sexuality, fatherhood, motherhood, all of those issues that are happening in today's society that sometimes don't, we're not at the table together and have these conversations. So that's one of the things that we're doing, creating these safe spaces. The men's roundtable is one, and we also have a faith roundtable as well, which brings different people of faith communities, because it's important. One thing that when we first started was many people said that they did not want to go to systems. They wanted to go to their faith-based institution instead. But what was happening is that people were sending, survivors would go to their pastor or the imam or their rabbi, and, they were kind of sent home and set to pray on this, and so what that did was it endangered them even further. So many lives were lost. So we felt that it was important to really build faith communities' capacity, help them build alliances with community-based organizations that deal with domestic violence or sexual violence in their communities, so that they can, actually provide resources and not become social workers themselves or anything like that, but to kind of, be able to help their congregations who are struggling with these issues around violence against women or other forms of violence. So, creating these spaces are very, very important as a strategy around engaging men and then having these conversations about masculinity and violence. So, in one self-promotion piece, so actually the men's roundtable is tonight. If if you all want to spread the word to any men you feel can contribute from it, that happens tonight at my office here in Harlem. And then on June 13th, this is something that we're doing for the fourth consecutive year, and we've partnered with Councilwoman Jalissa Ferreras, who was the chair of the Women's Issues Committee at New York City Council, and other city council members. And what we do is we bring community, and we also put pressure on city council to make sure that they fund and restore funding for sexual violence programs and domestic violence programs in the city. So all of this is kind of strategic in the back of my mind in terms of thinking around how can we also put our issues on blast in terms of the city government and budgeting and what have you, and also creating a platform for men and fathers. All are welcome, but in particular men and fathers to really kind of use this as an opportunity to, this is the activism piece, to really kind of use this as an opportunity to make a pledge to stand up against domestic violence, to stop committing forms of domestic violence and getting the help that they need. So all of that is very, very important, and this is one way of doing that. And this year we're calling on 10,000 fathers and men to make this pledge. Because one thing about crime in the city, and as you all probably know, sexual violence and domestic violence kind of gets lost in the violence statistics, but those statistics actually remain the same or increase every year, although other forms of violence goes down. So it's really important to kind of use this as a platform of advocacy, activism, and giving people an opportunity to really take a part of, looking at violence in their intimate relationships, personal relationships, family relationships, and community, and how all these things are interrelated. So, and with that, so we look at sexual violence, and if you can't talk about sexual violence if you're not talking about HIV and AIDS or substance abuse. So we look at how domestic violence is a, intersecting issue or a layered issue with people who are struggling with those issues, and maybe the causation of that, particularly forms of sexual violence, can also lead to STIs, and which makes you more, just in being a victim of violence changes, who you are and your body chemistry, and lessens your white blood count, makes you more susceptible to STIs and STDs, which also makes you more susceptible to HIV and AIDS, which may be from the impetus of sexual violence or sexual control or domestic violence. So it's important to kind of make these links for people in the city to see how all of this is related, and that sexual violence and domestic violence is a crime that should be taken seriously like other forms of violence, but then really figuring out which ways of approaching it. So that's why engaging men and boys is important to us. So I invite you all to come, spread the word about the Father's Day Pledge on June 13th at 12 p.m. at City Hall. And then that evening, we're going to have one of our community dialogues to really kind of bring people together, everyone from the community, to talk about what does it mean to have this pledge and which way forward. Thank you.
So does anyone have any questions for Q? In the meantime, while we're waiting for questions, someone did have a question for Jared. Jared, could you unmute?
Sure. Hello?
Okay.
Hey.
Yeah. So the question was, typically we understand sexual violence to be a result of male privilege. How do we understand IPV in female-female relationships?
All right, so that's a great question. Certainly, traditionally we think of heterosexual male privilege as being a component of sexual violence and intimate partner violence, but AVP also looks at the the reasons or why violence happens, in particular intimate partner violence amongst LGBTQ folks, is for similar reasons that it happens in heterosexual relationships, and it may look different in some ways, but we certainly define intimate partner violence in general as a pattern of power and control, and certainly those dynamics can happen in any type of relationship, as you know, and certainly that's inclusive of lesbian relationships or same-sex relationships amongst women. So that's kind of how we look at it. But certainly, you know, as well as the influence that misogyny and sexism has when we're talking about violence and intimate partner violence in heterosexual relationships, we certainly see that those dynamics play out amongst LGBTQ people as well. So it's usually where there's one partner that has a disproportionate level of power and control in the relationship, and that can take various forms.
All right, thanks. And we're just waiting for some other questions to roll in, but while I have you guys both not muted, would you both like to talk about any challenges or limitations that you've encountered in your work, especially, you know, dealing with healthy masculinity programming?
Sure. You know, I think like I mentioned earlier, you know, one, it's that it's not a one-size-fits-all, so I think it's important to really kind of look at and pull from, you know, different models and curriculums, you know, the principal issues. But I think one thing that I found that was helpful in terms of dealing with that obstacle is, one, getting the buy-in from the people that we're working with as much as possible. You know, a lot of times it turns out that, you know, it may be the same issues that we want them to leave with that they want to discuss. So I think that's very important to really realize that. And that, you know, looking at this from a really, from a cultural lens and also a racial lens, I think is really important because what may work in one community will certainly not work in another community depending on, you know, what the relationship is to power and control and, you know, autonomy, which is really important to kind of really focus on. So I think that's one thing. And I think, you know, and then working with in schools and the Department of Education, you know, I find it very difficult, and we've, you know, somehow found a way through really looking at, you know, from hard work and, you know, knowing certain people to getting into the school system between 9 and 3, where most of the learning and most of the attention is taking place, and really moving from, you know, this idea that, you know, what should happen in school is that they study and worry about these standardized tests rather than looking at what are the issues around some of the young men and women that they're trying to educate. They're experiencing trauma, you know, so something that's a really impediment to their ability to learn. So in looking at what type of trauma is that, a lot of that is violence in the home, a lot of that is violence in their communities, so really making those connections and then having these zero tolerance policies and looking at how school to prison or cradle to prison pipelines impact certain communities, and then dealing with all those issues and then having to deal with sexual violence or domestic violence. So just in terms of like the, you know, systemic and institutionalized forms of racism and oppression are always the major obstacle around talking about masculinity. But one thing I always kind of put into context is how masculinity is at the root of a lot of the financial issues that we have in, you know, in the city or even the country around. Is at the core of war, is at the core of other forms of violence that are kind of interrelated. So just those things are, you know, become the obstacles that we face. And then also one last thing is that particularly when we're engaging young people, and, you know, I think, you know, a lot of prevention models are we have to reach the youth and start with the youth because we can change their attitudes now, but the thing is we're not with them all the time. So we have to really, wherever we work with young people, we have to work with the adults in their lives, and particularly reaching out to men. And it's not that young people don't have men in their lives, it's what type of men do they have, or are they demonstrating positive behavior or negative behavior. So we have to really be consistent in the work we do with young people and really have that consistent positive, healthy form of masculinity around them and multiple forms of masculinity around them so they can kind of discern who they really want to be and have some choices and options.
All right, thank you. That was really thorough. Jared, do you have anything that you want to add to that?
Sure. I would think just in general, as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, there is just very little data and empirical research out there on sexual violence in LGBTQ communities. So that's an issue that comes up for us a lot, and we're working to change that. I think we're also the only organization in New York City that specifically focuses on sexual violence in LGBTQ folks, which can be difficult at times, but we certainly work closely with the Alliance and all, many of the folks that are on the webinar at the moment. So that is very helpful in terms of being able to provide services and work on prevention efforts around sexual violence and LGBTQ folks. I also think there's a huge stigma around sexual violence within LGBTQ communities. So I think creating dialogue amongst LGBTQ folks has definitely been a challenge, and recognizing that sexual violence happens within the community. That's been a big challenge. And one thing back in, we also follow a lot, we track and provide services to folks who've experienced violence when going onto hookup or online dating sites, which is a quite popular way in particular for gay, bisexual, and men who have sex with men to meet other men, to engage in various sexual activities. And as Q mentioned, it's hard to not take into consideration issues around HIV and substance use, and also as well as working with sex worker communities, in particular trans women who are engaged in sex work and male sex workers who often are at high risk for experiencing sexual violence, and which is connected in some way to the hookup and online dating sites. And many of the folks that report experiences of violence are reporting sexual violence, and within the context of meeting someone that they met online or in a phone application and using substances, and someone may be HIV positive or not disclosing HIV status. And so that's been a huge issue, and also getting some of the hookup and online dating sites to work with us and partner with us and with other community-based organizations that are kind of focused on this issue. So that's been a really, really big challenge, because also many of the men that have experienced the various forms of violence from when meeting folks on these sites understandably do not want to work within the criminal legal system to come to some type of resolution. So we have limitations when we're trying to address these issues with folks often. So that's been one of the big challenges that we've been working on recently.
Yeah, and I would like to say thank you to Jared and AVP, because they've really helped us develop our work with the LGBTQH communities. We have, and they're part of our Connect Training Institute, so we offer that 3 times a year, and Darlene Torres comes in and does that section for us and really makes some really important, gives a lot of information to our community partners who come to our training. So I really appreciate, AVP and the work that they're doing. And it's important that, all these organizations exist, and we find ways of, staying connected and collaborating and just staying alive. So, thanks to AVP and Jared and Catherine and Sharon Staple over there.
Oh, thanks, Q. We're big fans of you guys, too.
Well, thank you to both of you so much. Your portions of the presentations were really interesting and insightful, and I think they definitely added a lot. We actually, do you both have anything else that you want to add?
Gotcha.
Or is that about it?
I don't think I have anything else.
Okay, so I actually have 2 last slides that I'm going to present, but I did want to thank you both. Your presentations were really great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Joanna, and the Alliance and everyone.
Yeah, thank you all.
So I think, as I previously mentioned, we did a joint project with the Columbia University social work students, a small group of them, and these students surveyed 63 male respondents of various ages via a number of different platforms, Facebook, in person, SurveyMonkey, email, things of that nature. And they asked them to name their healthy masculinity role model and 3 reasons why. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is because Jared and Q both talked about ways to engage men in the discussion of healthy masculinity. And this is a pretty interesting and easy way to engage boys and men in your community. So once we gathered all the responses, we typed them up and cut them into individual strips of paper. And actually what you see on the slide is a word cloud of all the different responses describing why the respondents picked that specific healthy masculinity role model. So like I said, we cut up the different strips of paper with each response on it, and then we coded the responses by listing recurring grouping themes and writing them on flip chart paper and taping the flip charts all around the room. And we just put all the strips of paper in a pile and taped each response strip to its respective category. Also, during this process, we decided that responses could go in multiple categories if it made sense. So the total percentage exceeded 100, but this really helped us to visualize the distribution of responses, and it was also a really great and interactive way to engage people in a conversation about what healthy masculinity means to them, what it might look like, what are some of the characteristics, what are the values that are assigned to it, and why people choose the role models that they did. So finally, in our last slide, this kind of just aptly summarizes the results. And as you could see, for categories such as physical and attractiveness and achievement and success, unknown role models outweighed the number of known. So this suggests that perhaps when people think of healthy masculinity in more abstract or ideal terms, in other words, maybe thinking of, famous people or celebrities, more tangible characteristics that are easily measured become the most salient. So, for example, if you're thinking about a celebrity, the first thing that you might notice about them is their physical stature and attractiveness. There's definitely a disproportionate emphasis on physical elements when it comes to using unknowns as an ideal for healthy masculinity versus knowns. To a lesser extent, achievement is also valued. However, this trait was also captured by some other nuanced categories. Balance and honesty and integrity were equally expected of both unknown and known role models listed. And it's possible that these traits are more easily identifiable and equally valued. And perhaps this equal spread indicates that these 2 categories have been included in the healthy masculinity narrative due to a variety of norms operating at all levels of the spectrum. So individual, relationship, community, societal, all of those levels place a great value on balance and honesty and integrity. The scale was clearly weighted towards those who respondents knew personally. So as you could see from the table, many people listed real men in their lives. Support and provides for family, etc., actually had the largest sample size, and this illustrates that this particular attribute is a strong component of the majority's idea of healthy masculinity and is heavily emphasized. Also, not surprisingly, this category had the highest proportions of knowns listed because that is like a very personal category. And again, this suggests that the presence of this quality among known males is paramount and held in high regard. And lastly, wisdom and guidance and likable and charismatic, hardworking, determined, overcame adversity, and respectful and considerate all favored knowns over unknowns. Perhaps this is because these are traits that respondents can appreciate more when they actually know the person. So that concludes the presentation, and I just want to thank Jared and Q, our guest presenters, again. They did a really great job. And for everyone who's curious, these slides will be available on our website over the next few weeks. And here is, everyone's contact information listed if you have any further questions. And we encourage you to visit the Alliance website. So thank you, everyone, and thanks for participating. And we hope you enjoyed it and found it informative. Thanks.
Thank you. Please stand by.